Hello and welcome to another live stream with Just in Time Worlds with Marie. I hope that you guys are uh, looking forward to this. We are going to be talking today about the process of showing your world to your reader, the process of avoiding info dumps and actually taking your reader into your world in an engaging and immersive way, and some techniques to smuggle your world building into the story rather than using info dumps or just spilling the information onto the page. So, as I always do before I get going deep into this, if somebody can confirm for me in the chat that everything is coming through okay and that the stream is working, I would appreciate that. This is our first live stream in the new studio. It's the first one since I've moved. So, yeah, this is the new setup, as it were. My cats are somewhere behind that curtain. So, yeah. Okay. So, Tony says it's good, and welcome to Tony. And let's talk first a little bit about what an infodump is and when it's bad and when it's good. Okay, so first off, I just want to say that you're never going to get away completely from writing any kind of infodump. Of course, at times, you're going to write a paragraph or two of purely lore, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is not when you provide information in context for the reader. The problem is when you dump reams of information on top of the reader before they can get into the story, before they can get to love the character, before they can even experience your story at all. They must consume a whole textbook full of information. That's a problem. Okay. If you need to provide 5 paragraphs of context before they can catch a joke that one of your characters tells another, well, you know what they say about explaining jokes, right? It just stops being funny at that point. So, what you need to do is basically smuggle those info dumps in so that they're there when the reader needs them, but they're interactive, they're immersive, and to the reader, it feels like they're consuming the info dump as part of the story. They're not being taken out of the story in order to learn about the world. They learn about the world as part of the story. It's all one immersive experience. Okay, so I realize that sounds like a crazy amount of stuff to say. So let's break that down into some ways in which you can achieve this. Now, because I personally learned through examples, I'm going to quote some examples both from my own work and from the work of some published authors. Now, the reason why I use my own work is because I obviously know what I was trying to achieve inside the scene. And because I know what I was trying to achieve inside the scene, it's easy for me to explain what I was trying to do and then for you to analyze whether I achieved that for you or whether I didn't achieve that for you, right? But and the other reason, obviously, I use my own work is I can't get copyright issues on my own work. For the authors that I'm using in this, I am using their work under fair use license in order to teach and not to obviously replicate their copyrighted work. If you enjoy the components that I read from these authors, please do look them up. Please do purchase their books. They are well worth reading. Okay, so with all that out the way and kind of the structure of what we're going to do here, let's talk about our first actionable technique for smuggling your world into your narrative. Okay, so the first one is under the broad heading of character actions and dialogue. All right, but it's less dialogue. We will come to dialogue, but it's less dialogue and more about actions and emotions in this section. How a character describes a place illustrates how they feel about the place, and that gives it a immediate connection to the character and allows you to build a sense of its history and its environment and its culture into the way that the character thinks about this place. And that interaction with the environment naturally communicates the details of the environment to the reader. Okay. So, the first example I'm going to quote from here is from my science fantasy book, which is Magic Fall. And I have some covers over there. So I'm just going to read this little excerpt to you and then we can talk about it. Okay. The queue stretched before Bury like an undulating river of bodies. Families stood together, some talking quietly, most not talking at all. Need burning in every haggard gaze and empty pocket. The line spilled right up to the edges of the concrete sidewalk, barely avoiding the sleek magnet pods barreling down the street. Tinshaw's Precinct HQ towered over it all. The flat grey roof reached to just below the giant displays of the current date and time on the dome. Despite the size of the building, the precinct officers allowed only 2 petitioners and their kin in at the same time. The crowd bulked the line beyond the entrance portal, and Bury estimated she was 8 spots from the front. One place ahead of her, a small boy tugged at his mom's hand. "I'm hungry." His yellow eyes dominated a pinched face, too thin for his age. The mother tugged him close to her skirt with one hand, a small babe cuddled in her other. "I'm sorry, lovey, we're out of kitchen stamps. Mommy is here to ask for more." He buried his face in the threadbare cloth, and the black lines on his sunken cheeks scrunched together. His mother patted his orange hair, the hollow in her throat deepening as she swallowed. Bury slipped her hand into her pocket, but she didn't even have a stray bit of bread. Okay. So Dylan, oh my goodness. Hello, Dylan. um, Good to see you here. Okay, so what I was trying to achieve in that description, and hello, Paul. Um, what I was trying to show in that description is that this precinct of the city that they're in, the precinct of Tinshaw, is one that is poor. These people need government assistance to live. They need food stamps in order to survive. This mother and her child, and I was trying to create an oppressive atmosphere to show that to the reader rather than saying, well, Tinshaw is one of the more oppressed districts of the city and requires the assistance of government to succeed. And that's why I used words in the description like um, need burning in every haggard gaze and empty pocket. And I described the line as long. It spilled right up to the edges of the concrete sidewalk. And even the reluctance of the government to help in terms of they only let 2 people in at a time. And then I was also building in there that government assistance in this case is spread through the precinct force. The policing force actually also provides the assistance to the people of the city. They're both the law enforcement and everything else. And so that was kind of what I was aiming for in that to give all of that information to the reader. So I don't know if there are any questions about that one. If there aren't, I will move on to my second example in this topic, which is George R.R. Martin, an excerpt from George Martin. This is from Caitlin's first chapter, Caitlin's introduction. Caitlin had never liked this Godswood. She had been born at Tilly, at River Run, far to the south, on the red fork of the Trident. The Godswood there was a garden, bright and airy, where tall redwoods spread dappled shadows across tinkling streams. Birds sang from hidden nests, and the air was spicy with the scent of flowers. The gods of Winterfell kept a different sort of wood. It was a dark, primal place. 3 acres of old forest, untouched for 10,000 years, as the gloomy castle rose around it. It smelled of moist earth and decay. No redwoods grew here. This was a wood of stubborn sentinel trees, armored in grey-green needles, of mighty oaks, of ironwoods as old as the realm itself. Here, thick black trunks crowded close together, while twisted branches wove a dense canopy overhead, and misshapen roots wrestled beneath the soil. This was a place of deep silence and brooding shadows, and the gods who lived here had no names. But she knew she would find her husband here tonight. Whenever he took a man's life, afterward he would seek the quiet of the Godswood. So, in this piece, what Martin communicates to us is that there are two kinds of Godswoods. There is the one in the south that is a gentle place, and it is a gentle, civilized realm that Caitlin loves. She comes from there. It's a place that she appreciates. And then in the second description, in the one that where she is now, she describes how hard it is and how it is this place of primal forces that come together, rather than having the soft civilization of the South. And that in itself creates a world building setting between the North and the South of Westeros in that very description. So it's about how Caitlin feels about it, but it also communicates to the reader the kind of strength of these locations, just in the way that the character describes them and interacts with them. So I don't know if there are questions at this time. Guys, please do feel free to put questions in the chat. I will stop and look at them periodically, and I will interact with those questions as we go. Okay. So those are the less dialogue and more kind of focusing on the descriptions and the character actions. And sticking with character actions, let's talk about integrating cultural practices into the story. So this is where you show the culture through the things that people do, rather than just giving an explanation of the culture. Okay. So I'm going to start again with an example from my own work. And this is from the Ducal Heir. So Uwak's water tower tolled the third bell by the time that they reached the Blue Crane. They, in this case, is Naira, Darasaya, and Tahil. Tall green trees provided cool refuge for the fine establishment in the heat of the Kisangi summer. From the river dock, they followed a tiled mosaic path into a courtyard where a crane formed the centerpiece of a fountain, water tumbling from its long beak. The matron of the establishment met them there. She reminded Naira of a small bird's twittering rather than the majestic grace of a crane. Good wife, the woman fluttered, her eyes constantly drawn to Tahil's bare chest. My house is honored. Your husband's and yourself, I am quite overcome with the honor you do my house. Matron, Naira interrupted the flow of words. We seek lodging, not praise, if you please. What is the cost of your rooms? For a holy threesome? There is no charge, of course. The woman eyed Naira slyly. Naira's mouth twisted and she held out her hand to Darasaya. It was written that no priest could accept such a gift. Since the woman had not set the cost, she had to guess on the generous side of the balanced price. Her husband handed her a pouch. I rue the day the merchants found out the cost of balancing the scale. She gave the matron a sharp look, but counted out a measure of coin. As I said, the matron returned to her fluttering. My house is honored. Naira crossed her arms. Quite. Can you take us to our room? It has been a long journey. Okay, so what we saw there was a direct interaction of a priest who wants to just purchase place in a room, right? All she's looking to do is buy a night in an inn. And of course, there's this whole cultural exchange because it's immediately evident that she's a priest because she's wearing priestly vestments. And as she has this interaction, the woman's like, yes, well, I'm not going to set a price because I want you to give me the maximal price because the temples insist that that is the way it should be done. Um, and so that is kind of how you do little cultural exchanges. They don't have to be long. You don't have to devote a whole scene to cultural exchanges, although we'll do an example later where there is almost a whole scene is framed by the cultural exchange. A cultural exchange can be short. It can be in the way that people greet each other, in the way that people establish whether they bargain. In Lumiaron, I have this gesture which indicates that a merchant is ready to bargain or that a merchant is unwilling to bargain. And I use it once or twice, in the books because it is just a very short cultural exchange of like, I'm willing to bargain, I'm not willing to bargain. That's it. And building these in shows that the culture has a bargaining culture, but there is also a means to short circuit bargains and just drive straight to the point. And that's kind of how you work in these cultural exchanges to show your culture to the reader in an immersive manner. Okay, so how are we doing for questions? We have so far done character descriptions and actions, and we've done cultural exchanges. Hey, Ray, good to see you. Has anybody got questions so far? If we're all good, we will move on to magic. All right, so magic. So the thing with magic is obviously there is a big temptation here to show to infodump your magic, right? To explain how your magic works, where it comes from, etc. Because you're like, well, the reader has to understand it and so on. This is especially prevalent with hard magic systems. Like it is so common with hard magic systems to just bleh all the rules onto the page. Resist that temptation. Even if your system is hard enough to play a video game with, resist the temptation to just blep your rules onto the page. What you want to do is you want the reader to experience the magic one way or another. So either magic hits them and they just use it, and they the recipient of it, or they're a mage and they use the magic as it flows over them, right? So I've got two examples here, one from myself and one from another author. Okay, so this is from my first book, and it demonstrates the use of a magic called hobby, which is an internally facing magic. Louis walked on through the narrow streets, strewn with the refuse of life, to the town's biggest market. He slipped into a quiet alley close to the square and stripped off the traveller's cloak, revealing the blue doublet with seed pearl buttons. The cloak went into the sack. The hat came out. Settling Leno's baggy cap on his head, he pulled it to a jaunty angle on his crown, tip hanging to one side. He touched his purse and his heart, closing out the world. Following the fourth beat of his heart, he reached inward and tapped on the core strength of his Elamar. He held the hot power steady inside himself and imagined Leno's face, overlaying his own, utilizing the hobby technique called mask. As he released the magic, bones shifted, forcing his visage to a leaner shape. The power darkened his skin and smoothed out the slant of his eye sockets, disguising his northern heritage. As he touched the soft merchant's hat, his well-disciplined mind boxed up Louis into a quiet corner, and he knew who he was. Leno the merchant walked out of the alley that Louis the traveler had entered. Okay, so here I'm literally just taking Louis through a transformation. Since this is the first time the reader is experiencing hobby magic, I go into some detail of what it feels like. He follows the beat of his heart. He finds his Elamar, which is the reader should know by now is his magical strength. And then he just does the thing. and I describe what that feels like for the character, right? But that's the only time that I describe the magic in this much detail. Next time that Louis uses this ability to change his face, I just go, he puts on a hat, he changes his face, Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your aunt, we move along with the story, right? Because you only need to show it once. But that one showing, ideally, you don't want it to be an infodump, you want it to actually show. So another example of this comes from Adrian Tchaikovsky's Empire of Black and Gold. So this is quite early on in the books, and our two characters are running away from the wasps. Che did not want, under any circumstances, to be out there with nothing but the strength of her grip to save her from a dive into infinity. The wasp soldiers were coming, though, so her preferences seemed irrelevant. You first, she said, and Salma simply dived straight through the hatch. As soon as he was clear of it, his art wings blurred into life about his shoulders, catching him in the air where he hovered and spun while waiting for her. And so you see immediately, there's the magic system right there. It's his art wings, right? And you can see that, look, obviously you can't see that because I've just read it to you, but art in this case is capitalized. There's no explanation of what art is, although we will learn a lot more about it during the course of the 10-book series. I'm finally on book 10 of the series. And I have to tell you, like, by now, I not only understand art, I know where it comes from, I get what it means. It's like central to the entire, the whole thrust of the series. It's been a ride, this series. I've really enjoyed it. In case anybody's looking for a new epic fantasy series to dive into, I can recommend this one. But yeah, so he just goes ahead and says, they're art wings. They are essentially magical wings that allow Salma to fly. And that just is how it is. There you go. Off he goes. And it's just a very elegant, here it is, here's how it works. And because here's the thing, you don't need to expound on these things. You think that the reader needs all these details to enjoy your story, but they don't. The reader is a fantasy reader. They like finding out about your world over the course of the story. You just need to give them enough to understand this scene, to understand what is happening in this moment, not to understand the whole of the 10-book series. Like, if Adrian here had stopped and he'd said, and apt comes from the fact that the insect kindern are connected to their source kindern, and it's this kind of blah 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 blah. I won't spoil the whole series for you guys, so I'll keep my mouth shut. But if he'd spilled all of that information here, it would have destroyed my enjoyment of the books. Less is more. Okay? Less allows you to give the reader more later on. So don't fall into the trap of thinking you need to explain all this to the reader. Think about what they really need, really, really, really need to understand just this scene, and make sure they have that. Okay. And the way that you test whether you've put enough in there is obviously ask your beta readers if they ever got confused. Like, did they not understand how something happened? Did something take them out of the story? That's how you test whether you've got enough in there. But don't put in too much. Less is more in the case of this stuff. Okay. So that was magic. I don't know if there's any other questions, because we are now going to move on to the big one, the very big one, which is dialogue. Okay, so dialogue is a super powerful tool in world building. It basically lets the writer convey information in a way that feels organic and engaging because people are talking about it. But before we get into good examples and how to use dialogue, I want to talk about a terrible, 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 terrible pitfall that no one should use in dialogue. And that is the as you know, Bob dialogue, the dreaded as you know. Okay, so As you know, Bob dialogue occurs when characters state information that they already know. These two characters already know it. They're stating it purely for the reader. Okay. So, an example of this is, as you know, Bob, the kingdom's taxes are crippling the peasants and the rebellion is gaining strength. Yes, I know that. I'm not an idiot, and it feels like such unnatural and such forced dialogue, this, as you know, Bob dialogue. And it breaks the immersion because it's unrealistic. People don't explain things to each other that they already understand. Okay, so to avoid this trap, there are three ways to think about this. One is consider the character's perspective. Would they really share that information with this person they're talking to? If not, don't do it like that. Find another way. Two, reframe the scene. And we'll get to how to do that because there are different ways in which you can reframe the scene to make the dialogue work, even if it is things that the other character knows. And then your third one is anchor the information. So make sure there's a believable reason for the information to be exchanged. And we will talk about that one right now. How do you anchor information? So you anchor information either by having an anchor character or by creating a framing device for the scene to happen. Now, an anchor character is someone who is unfamiliar with a setting, the news, or the skill, or that is being the skill that is being explained, which creates a natural opportunity to explain the details. All right. So it's somebody who doesn't know who is being told. That's an anchor character. Okay. And this could be a farm boy joining a mercenary band, or a foreign diplomat learning local customs, or a student undergoing training, or even someone just getting the news. Since the outsider genuinely needs the information, the exposition feels organic. All right. So, an example of that is, "What's with all the red flags?" asked the boy, squinting at the tents. And then the captain says, "That means the mercenary companies have agreed to a truce here. You'd better memorize that. The attacking a red flag zone is a death sentence." So it's information the new kid on the block needs to understand, and that also communicates it to the reader. Okay, so that's the anchoring character driving the dialogue. But you don't have to have an anchoring character. And in fact, I'm not the world's biggest fan of the anchoring setup. It always feels to me a little bit like, yeah, but do we have to have somebody dumb in every scene who needs to ask the questions of the world the whole freaking time? Um, so it is a little bit it is a little bit frustrating to me that there's always these anchor characters. It's the easiest of devices to use, and there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, like, don't be afraid to use it, but you do have other options. So um let me just check the questions and we can go into the next one. um Okay, so thanks, Einar. I do try not to overhype my own stuff because, I'm just one chick writing content over here. Okay, so um, let's talk about conflict-driven conversations. So in conflict-driven conversations, what you want to do is you want to create some kind of conflict that will make people repeat information they already know in order to win the conflict. All right. So you have two options here in conflict. um Mayo says, could you give an example of using it to getting the news? Yeah, so I was actually going to quote from Martin, continuing with a Catlin scene, but the problem was it was like pages long, and I don't want to risk getting like copyrighted, even though it is fair use to use it to teach and all the rest of that. So, but in Catlin's first chapter, She is speaking to Ned about the news that he has received about Beyond the Wall, creating a situation where the Black Watch, oh, I forget their name, the Night Watch are getting a lot of backlash from Mance Rider and the wildlings, and he gives her news that she doesn't have, which he received in a letter. So she asks him questions about the news he's received, and he explains to her the contents of the letter, which also, of course, means that the reader is getting the news along with a very natural explanation of there are these wildlings who live beyond the wall and who are there's a night watch that defends against the wall. So I don't even think you need to buy the book. I think you could probably just get the sample on Amazon, and it's the second chapter in Game of Thrones. It's the opening few pages of that book. And you can see a very natural example of Ned getting news and through dialogue giving that news to Caitlin, and through that dialogue introducing all of those concepts in a very, very natural way. So yeah, that would be my example. I didn't prep it because, well, I started to prep it and then I was like, man, this is pages long. so that's why I didn't read it here. Okay, so conflict-driven conversations. Your first option with conflict-driven conversations is the baiting the bear technique. Okay, that's what I call it. It's not the official name. So, I'm not sure if there is an official name, but this technique basically turns your dialogue into the sparring contest. Both characters know the information, but one character forces the other to acknowledge it, to say it out loud. They basically turn the conversation into a I'm going to make you say the quiet part. Okay. And this can reveal a world of details while showcasing the personalities of the characters and their relationships. Okay, so just an off the cuff example is, so, said the knight, leaning back, are we going to talk about the fact that you let the dragon go? I didn't let it go, snapped the mage. I negotiated its departure. Sure, with a treasure chest and half the kingdom's wine reserves. So you can see that there, the knight it's not an argument as such. It's I'm going to make you say it. I'm going to make you acknowledge this. Now, I've got an example which we'll do at the end of the stream where we'll analyze one of my chapters in kind of more broad detail, where I use this technique a lot in order to get the exposition going in a way that still has conflict for the reader. The other way that you can use conflict-driven exposition is through straight-up arguments. Okay, so I've got an example here from my own work, which is from the Lion Vessel. Oh, goodness. The Lion Vessel, which is my third book. This conversation takes place directly after a battle, and it's like basically a whole group of people discussing the post battle situation, right? And it's from the perspective of the emperor, who's kind of uncertain on his throne because he's in the middle of leading a rebellion. Okay, everyone looked inquiringly at Olunt, and he threatened to rise in his cheek under their regard. What is our status this morning? Despite the heroic efforts of the healers and the priests, we took heavy losses last night. Duke Ruffy spoke through gritted teeth, his voice strained but calm. We lost 28,000 men, with another 30,000 wounded. Alunt gripped the edge of the table as a wave of weakness rolled over him. Almost a fifth of the Transchlag army killed in one attack. Narrator straightened up. We will continue to work with the healers, though at a reduced pace from the immediate aftermath of the battle. Why so many? Duchess Yolanda asked. What went wrong? Duke Ruffy whipped his head in her direction. Wrong? The enemy attacked us with an unknown magic and breached our walls. What do you think we could have done differently? She sat back, her mouth pursed. Maybe better walls, or more priests who can heal. Alund held up his hand to stop the brewing fight, but Naira spoke over the gesture, glaring at both Ruffy and Yolanda. Priests who can call on the gods do not jump fully formed from the mud, nor do we have enough Soa charms for them all. A matter that requires attention from your guilds. A flicker of quiet fell over the table, and Alund threw his words into the gap. We were all on the field last night, and I'm sure we're all tired today. And you, at least, shouldn't have been on the field. Duke Ruffy slammed his cup down on the table. You're the only emperor we have. What possessed you to go out there and risk yourself? Heat climbed up Alund's throat and spilled onto his cheeks. I helped. The fire was my idea. And you think no one else could have had that idea? Ruffy leaned over the table. No one else can fill your sash. Anyone can die on a battlefield. Alund snapped to his feet, his chair falling over behind him. If I'm your emperor, treat me with some trodden respect. The table shook as Ruffy leaped up and opened his mouth, but herself rose and put her hand on his arm. My liege, it is only concern for your life that drives us to raise this matter. Ruffy, it was a terrible night for us all, but we need to move forward. So in that dialogue, they're basically recapping a scene that happened that the reader's seen and they've seen. But the argument lends it a new tension and allows me to give the casualty figures from the battle through dialogue while still maintaining conflict. They're having a literal fight about this about the fight that they've just had. It's like a blame game, that they're having around this table, where they're fighting each other, trying to find someone to blame for the disaster of the battle that was the previous night. And so it's this. It gives it, at least I think, like, listen, guys. I mean, this is my own writing. Of course, I think it's brilliant. Like, otherwise, why would I be writing, right? But I think that scene provides a tension that gives the information to the reader in a way that is more engaging than just spelling out, this is how much they lost, this is the dire situation they're in, they don't have enough priests, they don't have enough of this, half of the army's down, etc., etc. So those are two big ways in which you can use dialogue, is to have your baiting the bear conflict or your actual arguments conflict. Alrighty. Questions? We're good? Okay. So the third way to make dialogue natural and to avoid, as you know, is stating the obvious. So stating the obvious is having your characters restate information that they know to express emotion or reinforce the stakes. Okay, so this works really well when paired with strong emotional subtext, like the character is angry or they're sad or they're really happy or whatever, and they're stating information they know with that attachment, with that emotional attachment. So I'm going to, for this one, I have an example from Kashil's Dart by Jacqueline Carey. So I'm picking up here where Fedre, the narrating character, and it's a first person point of view character. So the narrating character is has not been able to do her job as a Angusette and an escort and as Namaha's servant for quite some time because she's not been guarded, right? And now she's going to state things that she knows in a conversation with her lord. And I'll take you through why I think this is a good example. Okay, so let me just pick up. Delaney smiled briefly, but his eyes were serious. Fedre, before I speak further, I would ask you somewhat. You have some idea that there is a purpose in what I do, and if I have not revealed it to you, you know well enough that it is because I would afford you as much protection as ignorance allows. But I am reminded of late how very slight that protection is. What you do is dangerous, my dear. You have said it once, but I ask again. Is it still your will to pursue this service? My heart leapt. He was offering another assignation. My lord, you know it is, I said, making no effort to disguise my eagerness. Very well. His gaze drifted past me, seeing again whatever it was Delaney saw, then returned to my face. Know then that I am not minded to take the same risk twice. Henceforth, your safety will be assured by a new companion. I have arranged that you will be warded by a member of the Casseline Brotherhood. My mouth fell open. My lord will have his jest, I said faintly. No, a glimmer of amusement flickered in Delaney's eye. It is no jest. My lord, you would set some dried up old stick of a Casseline brother to trail after me? Between outrage and astonishment, I nearly stammered. On an assignation? You would set a crotchety 60-year-old celibate to ward a servant of Namaha? An Anguizette, no less? Name of Eloah, I'd rather you brought back Maketh. So what she communicates here is the Casseline Brotherhood is a celibate order that's, and they're some kind of bodyguards of some sort, and they're all old, right? Is basically what she's communicating here. And then it very naturally goes into an actual piece of information about the Casselines, where she then continues in first person narration. For those who are unfamiliar with Dangeline culture, I will explain that the Casseline Brotherhood, like Eloah's companions, Casil, are alone and united in their disapproval of the ways of blessed Eloah. Like Casil, they serve with a steadfast devotion, but I cannot imagine anything more off-putting to a patron of Namaha than their cold-eyed disdain. Aside from that, they were dreadfully unfashionable. So, you see, that actually was an information dump following that line of dialogue, right? So we had the character state the obvious. She used the dialogue to state the obvious, to build the world in. And then she very clearly had the little bit of information dump right there. Roadjet, yes, this is absolutely live right now. So you can ask questions and I will answer them. So she states the obvious in that moment, and because of that, even though it's information she knows, it's information Delaney knows, it doesn't feel like as you know Bob dialogue. It feels like it's a real conversation real people would have. Okay, so those are your three techniques with dialogue, in my opinion, that really makes dialogue work. It's either you have an anchor character that genuinely doesn't know the information, whether that's because they're in an unfamiliar situation, they're in an unfamiliar place, they're awaiting, they don't have the news yet, etc. So they can naturally ask questions. That's your one. Your second way is with conflict-driven conversations, either baiting the bear or argumentation. And your third is with stating the obvious. Okay, so those are how I would use dialogue in order to build out the world. So I don't know if there are any questions at this time, but we can move. Guys, please do put the questions in the chat. I will get to them, I promise. I am quite good with checking questions and getting to them. All right, so next let's talk about environmental storytelling. So environmental storytelling is where the setting itself conveys details about the world without explicit explanation. And it's again about how the characters interact with the world, but this time it's more environmental and what the setting reveals about the culture, the history, or the current events. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Ducal Air. So, heat simmered off the Luzala Sea, impregnating the air with moisture. Sweat and water beaded on Aera's skin, runnels of liquid that did little to alleviate the heat. Mercifully, the breeze danced along her limbs, a blessed relief that also carried the stench of the city away from her nose. They hired a punt on recommendation of the fluttering matron of the Blue Crane. Greying hair clung to the dark scalp of the taciturn punter, drops of water sparkling on the wiry curls. He wore a breechclout as brief as Tahil's loincloth, but far less decorated. Sour charms clinked on his wrist as he drove the punt forward with his pole. The melody reminded the faithful to pray and be thankful, to strive for harmony and see the lesson in all burdens. His boat carried them safely through the canal and river traffic to the harbour, where Naira and Tahil alighted. Darasaya would continue to the market to shop and return for them afterward. The harbour master, Tahil suggested as they watched the punt vanish from sight. We might as well start there, Naira agreed. The great harbour of Uwak sprawled over the edge of the land. Tall ships crowded into every available slip, men throwing cargo to and fro as they loaded and unloaded the holds. A brawl boiled out of a rough dockside tavern, combatants flailing onto the street. Naira stepped fast to avoid a man rolling away from the fight, the reek of cheap beer on his smock. Lively bunch, Tahil said dryly. I will confess, I remember why I never liked harbours. Naira lifted the hem of her kamei out of the effluent that baked in the sun. Maybe we've just been mouldering too long in Magadla and it will grow on us. If anything here starts to grow on you, your hobby has failed you, Naira replied tartly. Let's see to this harbour master. So in that scene, I'm literally giving the environment of there's the heat, the harbor. I'm painting the scene of the sailors coming out, and Naira's interacting with this, and her reaction to it is obviously one of not enjoying being here, right? And that gives a sense of what this city is like. It paints a port city for the reader without going into enormous detail of what a port city is. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the choice of um, wording that is also important in how you communicate your world, right? It gives the reader this flavor of the world without overwhelming them with all the details. And rather than just describing the fight coming out of the tavern, I also show like Naira interacting with it, even if it's just in terms of avoiding it. Okay. Then Maui asks, so adding more emotion is a way to avoid, as you know, Bob dialogue. Yes, absolutely. Adding more emotion is a way to avoid, as you know, Bob dialogue. If you give the dialogue emotion, that at a broad level, giving it either the argument, giving it the conflict, giving it baiting the bear, then you contribute to it feeling real, that the character would share this information even if it is something that they would already know, right? So they're sharing the information because of the emotion that is driving them. So yeah, it is a good way to look at it. And then Arnorm says, I had the same problem in one chapter. Both characters would know about the extra moons in the sky, but one finds his culture didn't care what they were named or why they were significant. Yeah. So cultural differences is a great way of exploring, of anchoring the conversation. They both know about it, but culturally they might call the moons different things. They might refer to them different ways. They might have different gods associated with them. And those cultural differences still anchor the conversation in terms of the characters can realistically exchange questions and answers about these two moons, and thus, of course, introduce the reader to the fact that there are two moons in the sky, and that's cool. Werbus says, I think tolerance for people to read infodumps is proportional to how curious they are. Yes, and that's why I say less is more, okay? Because you want people to stay curious. If you dump your whole world's lore up front, then people lose interest, okay? So what you want to do is you want to bring people into your world gradually. You want to give them a little bit of breadcrumb here and a little bit of breadcrumb there and a little bit of breadcrumb there. And then then gently, 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 you're reeling them in till they're in so deep and they're like, I have to know how this works. Explain it to me. And that's where you want the reader to be. So gradually. Um, Lucian says it's hard to find that balance where you've given the reader enough information. Absolutely. So this is a very hard balance to find, where you've given the reader enough but you're not laying out all the details. But I personally would err on the side of less. I would cut what you think might not be as extraneous. I would think I would cut down to the bare minimum, and then I would ask. Then I would go to my beta readers and I would say to them, okay, did you understand this? If you didn't, then I didn't do my job. So please don't lie to me. Don't tell me it was fine, whatever. Tell me if you understood what was happening in the scene. And then add more, because I promise you it is easier to add more. And beta readers will rather tell you they got confused than they'll tell you they got bored with your info dumps and quit reading. Okay. Because they don't want to hurt your feelings. Unless you're getting completely like off the street beta readers who don't know you at all. Most beta readers don't want to hurt your feelings. So if they got bored and they didn't finish the book because they got bored, right? Then they're not going to tell you that. They're just going to tell you it was fine. It was fine. But if they got confused and you specifically asking them, did you get confused? They will absolutely say, yes, I got confused in this scene. I didn't understand what was going on. And then you know that you need to add more detail here. And I think that's a fairly good way to try and get that balance right. Roger says, I thought of a question. How would you write a war where people have elemental powers? Oof. So, I mean, that's more than the topic of just this conversation. You'd have to show the elemental powers first. So this is also a key thing, right? So remember that magic, the conversation we had at the beginning of this live stream is I showed how magic works in my world. Then later, when people are using that internally facing magic during a war setting, I don't explain it again. I don't say they reach for their Elamar and they do this and they do that. I just have them use that ability, right? So they grow armor on their skin and take a blow on their skin because that is the ability that this magic gives them. So show your magic system, introduce the reader to these fantastical elements up front, introduce them to the fauna and flora, introduce them to the elemental magic system, and then write the battle with no more information dumps. The reader now knows everything they need to know, which you've introduced earlier in the book. And then you go balls to the wall and give them the whole battle scene like a crazy person. Okay, so introduction first and then balls to the wall afterwards. So introduce in calmer sequences, in earlier scenes, introduce all of that stuff. Ray says, what's awesome, what's boring, what's confusing, and what they didn't believe. Yeah, that is a good way to do it. I will tell you, though, that a lot of people won't tell you that anything is boring. They will lie. But it is a good question to ask. What's awesome, what's boring, what's confusing, and what they didn't believe. Anything that's confusing and that they didn't believe means you haven't done enough lore building. They don't know enough to work with the story. Okay. No problem, Rojit. You can still ask the questions anyway. All right, cool. So the last technique I just want to talk about before we dive into a big analysis chapter is you can also set your world building just by the words that you use. Okay. So a really good example of this is, and I'm not going to read the chapter because I'd have to read the whole chapter and that's too much. It's somebody else's work. Is John Gwain's Bloodsworn trilogy. So he in the first chapter, he uses the word steeding. And in the second chapter, he uses the word longship. And just those two words already set me in the mind of, okay, this is a Norse-inspired world, right? And he hasn't, like, of course, he's done lore building and world building, but because he's used those specific words, my head goes to the Norse or the old Germanic tribes, stuff like that. Like in my head, we're now in that location. Catherine Kerr does it as well, where she uses words inspired by the Celtic mythologies and so on, and that immediately and her names are Welsh inspired, so that they're all these kind of like Welsh names, and that immediately sets my mind in that location, right? And because of that, it establishes the world without the writer needing to do anything except choose good words, right? Words that evoke that culture, that time period. So if you're drawing heavily on one of Earth's cultures, and it doesn't have to be Europe, it can be anything, right? If you're drawing heavily on Korean culture, if you're drawing heavily on Japanese culture, if you're drawing heavily on Polynesian culture, if you use words and names inspired from that culture, you automatically put the reader into that mindset. And just by using the word, you get a whole bunch of world building out of it. The word does a whole lot of heavy lifting. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well. Um, Yeah, so Rosette, I actually earlier used GOT as an example, Game of Thrones as an example, and Robert and Eddard reminisced about the past, which, to be fair, that's another way that you can do it, because again, it's attaching emotion to, as you know, Bob, dialogue. They're talking to each other, reminiscing about the past in a way that feels natural. It's how people would talk about the past. They would talk about, do you remember that time in Beirut, in whatever, do you remember that time when Jamie did this, etc., etc. It doesn't feel like, as you know, Bob, dialogue, because there's emotion attached to it and it feels natural. And that's the art to using dialogue, is that making sure that you've got either that conflict associated with it, or that stating the obvious associated with it, or otherwise that kind of like emotion with it. 100%. Martin is a great example in this category of showing your world in this way. Okay, so I have one big example coming up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this in pieces, and then I will stop and explain what I was trying to do. And if you have questions, if the text sparks questions in you, let me know. All right. Um, so the black basalt rock used to build Watamo lent the city an ugly, oppressive air. Mount Kinna, the sleeping volcano that shadowed the port, did not alleviate the stifling feeling. The buildings loomed over Narrator, light of the street lanterns absorbed by jet walls. Perhaps in other circumstances it could have a stark beauty, but in this city it did not. But this city did not welcome her. So it's a description here where I'm trying to infuse the place with a gloomy feeling, because that's how Naira feels about the city. Okay. So now let's weave some culture into the setting. So I'm skipping a couple of lines. They get onto the roof, yada, yada, yada. We don't need all the details. All right. So they get onto the roof. Now, previously we have established that all three of these people are priests. They're married in a threesome. Darasaya wears this yellow coverall robe. Tahil wears a red loincloth, and Naira a blue dress. So that was all previously established, right? Remember, stories build on each other. Okay, so our three characters are on the roof, and Naira, Tahil held out a scarf. Her jaw clenched. Women with uncovered heads drew attention in Watamo. She understood the necessity, but the reality irked her. Beloved, Darasaya put his hand on her shoulder. Would you rather stay in the inn? No, I just don't like being forced. She took the scarf and tied it around her hair. She had made him accept the Orlings. She could not balk at this. His bare hair reminded her that he wore the hood and the veil of his vestments every day. Does it make me a hypocrite, Dari? I like seeing you in the caballade. Beloved, I could choose not to be a priest. Sweet and yet less vicious, his smile warmed her heart. I like wearing the caballade. And I'd prefer my loincloth, but here we are. The hill slid muscular arms around their waists. The lack of tinkling glass on his wrists jarred. She felt naked without her charms, adding to her discomfort, but they would have drawn attention. The hill drew her closer. Do we go or stay? They had to go. Darasia's friend had information about Viero. They might need that information once they arrived in the land where the metal flower's real counterparts grew. Go. Nahira kissed them both, stepping back and adjusting the scarf. They dropped from the flat-in roof into the dark alley. Okay, so what we have here is an immediate establishment of this is a culture that is not their own. This is conflicting gender roles, and it introduces a religious conflict, right? These people have got a different religion, a different conflict, and a different idea of gender roles than the culture from which Nayera and her husbands come. And we see that in both the dialogue and so on. And I don't have to exposition it. I don't have to explain it at this point. I just have to show this moment. Okay. Let me just have a drink of water. Oh, there. Okay. Then we get to the actual scholar's place. So he opens the door. The scholar Sayer hunched over a cane, small, even without age dragging at his shoulders. His white hair stood out sharply against his pale bronze visage, skin folded in deep creases around his brown eyes, one shrouded in the milk white of a cataract. Darasaya, his voice creaked with age. Come in, be welcome. The bolting of the stout door at their back brought relief from the tension of the streets. Three steps took them through the entranceway, and they spilled past a bead curtain into a wide room. Shelves lined the walls. Scrolls rustled with their passage, jammed 2 or 3 to a niche. Piles of texts hid the floor from view. A large desk strewn with manuscripts crowded against the far wall next to an arched doorway. Here, more strings of beads provided some privacy to the rest of the little house. The aroma of leather and ink lay heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of ashes from the small hearth. A black iron pan rested next to a ceramic coffee pot. Saya turned his head so that his good eye faced Darasaya. You look as young as you did in Magadla, Dari. The benefits of hubby? Indeed so, my friend. Darasaya took his hand with gentle fingers. It is good to see you again. And you. Sit, all of you. Oh, you have a woman. He paused in the middle of gesturing for them to find seats. Naira loosed her jaw with effort. I will make the coffee. She took the roasting pan through the beaded curtain to the kitchen. Her nose led her to the coffee beans, half spilling out of a burlap sack. Memories of a long ago childhood guided her through the steps of washing them. Even in Watamo, women could be in the presence of men under the formality of the coffee ceremony. So what this establishes is obviously the scene that they're going to be interacting with. So we have the scholar's environment given to us with the books and what that smells like and so on. And then the reaction again of Sayar, like, oh, it's a woman. For him, that's a problem. And then the establishment of what is going to be the framing device for the conversation, which is this cultural interaction of the coffee ceremony, which allows men and women to be in each other's presence. So all of that so far has been established, and I haven't at any point come out and explained that to the reader, right? It's just there with a few lines here or there to give some context. Okay, and I do try and engage all of the senses in the description so that to the reader it's an immersive experience. I don't know, like there are people who say, you should be more minimalist in your writing and the reader can imagine things and so on. But I tend to be more on the descriptive side. I don't know. Let me know in comments, what you guys think. Like more description, less description, too much, too little. You know, I'm interested in opinions. Okay. Anyway, so back to Naira. Now we're picking up with her coming out with the coffee. Naira came back through the beaded curtain with her pan of beans to find the men sitting on cushions unearthed from books and scrolls. She set the pan at the roasting height and prepared the bowls of nuts. Well, old friend, Saya turned his good eye to Darasaya. I looked for those references you wanted about Viero. The documents are very old. I don't know if you'll be able to read them. Did you read them? Darasaya asked, leaning forward. As much as I could with my old eyes, Saya replied. And I remember some of them from when I studied history, of course. What do you want to know? Naira sprinkled cinnamon over the beans. Whatever you can tell us, the hill sniffed appreciatively as he spoke. Let me see if I can summarize then. The old man turned his head to take in the aroma of roasting coffee filling his house. You know, of course, that in Watamo we do not say that the goddess is the balancer. Instead, we say that she serves her brother gods. Now, here you see he's using the as you know Bob dialogue framework, but he's using it to establish common knowledge, right? So he's going to give them information they don't know, but first he wants to establish that they do know. Naira gritted her teeth, hunching her shoulders over the mortar and pestle as she ground the beans. They needed this man's information. Nothing would be gained from having a canonical dispute with a scholar so ancient his hand practically rested on the wheel. She set the kettle to boil. Now, the reason why that's there is again to show that Naira does not agree with his statement. They have a they have a religious dispute going on here. So then the scholar continues. Vero rose as a sect that at first attracted only women. Back in those days, our women were almost slaves. They married where their fathers sent them and never held property in their own name. Vero claimed that the gods were a lie, perpetuated to crush the spirit of women. I can't imagine the Gusa tolerated that, Darasaya observed. He did not. Viero was declared an illegal sect and its followers hunted down. But sometimes when you persecute a thing, you make it more than it is. Saya accepted a glass cup from Naira and she poured the coffee, black steam falling from waist high without spilling a drop. The rich aroma of coffee brought a smile to Saya's face as he continued. So he then explains a little bit about Vero, which is not that important. This is all anchor character stuff. The threesome don't know about it, so it's natural that Saya would explain this information to them. But then we come here. So now Saya's explained the origin of Vero and so on. And then he says, the armies of Kisangi gathered for holy war against Watamo. Between the matriarch and the Gusa, they believed that they could strike first and drive all the way to Magadla's heart and perhaps force a peace with a balancer. Naira ground her teeth. The holy war had been initiated by Watamo. It was written. Could this man be baiting her? Saya's gaze locked on Naira's, his hand shaking as he accepted a small bowl of salted nuts. They swept through the continent like lava cutting soft earth, outflanking the armies massed across the flame straits. The fighting raged in the very streets of Magadla for 4 days before a relieving army could reach them. But the city held, and the army came, expelling Viero and Watamo both. Then did Kisangi truly march on Watamo. He paused and cupped at the glass mug in his hands. You are a priestess? He stared straight at Naira. He was baiting her. And yet she knew what had happened when the holy armies reached Watamo some 2 millennia ago. That too was written. He wanted to hear his side of the story. I am. Naira kept her voice low, seeking an even tone. Then you know. His gaze returned to his coffee cup. You say it. Naira set the pot and snack tray aside. She folded her legs under her and spoke with a gravity that the events merited. The combined might of the armies swept through Watamo and burnt the city. They raised the Gusa on the long spear, and next to him hung his family and generals. They swept the temples and impaled the priests. Thousands died, even more taken as slaves. Watamo was placed under the authority of Magadla. So he basically baits the bear. He forces her to acknowledge his side of the conversation, almost in payment for the information that he gives her about Viero. And then he gives her kind of the rest of the information, and he gives her some prophecy. And all of this is still like she's primarily the anchor character, but it also gives this whole conflict to the conversation. And all of it is framed by means of the ritual of the coffee ceremony, which allows them to interact in this way despite the strict gender roles. So then the conversation, the scene just ends when Naira and Tahil went to the kitchen to wash the cups, giving Darasaya some space to say goodbye to his friend for what would surely be the last time. Interesting tale, Tahil murmured as they poured heated water in the basin. Should we visit the island? To see the shrine for ourselves? Naira turned the thought over in her mind. I don't think it would help us. The empire is far from that shrine. We have learned much. By the grace of the goddess, it will be enough. She placed a mug on the drying rack and washed another. We must send word back to Magadla. They should know that some vestige of Viro survives here. We can do that at Gerardi. Tahil rinsed the last cup, his grin turning wicked. You pour a fine coffee. I learned the ceremony in the desert. She ran wet hands over his tight curls. You know what my mother taught me besides how to pour from the waist without spilling? No? How to hide the bodies of the boys who teased me. Next time we're in the desert, you'll have to show me, Tahil snickered. I could do with a good hiding place for the bodies of the boys who tease me. Naira choked on suppressed laughter. In a greatly improved mood, she followed Tahil out to collect their third. So that end basically just also closes the conversation, and in that dialogue establishes what they really found out from this conversation and what their next plans are, right? Putting context for the reader on, okay, you've now been through this whole conversation. Let's give you some framing context for what you've learned so that you can move forward into the next section. Okay. And that was what I prepared for this stream. I have yapped a lot today. We are on 1 hour and 20 minutes. It's the length of a movie. So Maui says, I'm one of those who starts skimming if there's too much description unless it's super engaging. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Depends, I suppose, on what you mean by engaging. Verbus says, both are good. Some are better with descriptions, others with shorter ones. It depends on if you build feel or sense of action and speed. Yeah, so I think it also is genre dependent. Like, I'm writing an urban fantasy, and I found myself being way less descriptive in that for the most part, because it's urban fantasy, right? You know what a car is. You know what a phone is. I don't need to describe those things. I don't need you to experience those things. You know what those things are as the reader. So I can just go like, meh, here you go. Have a phone. She phones someone, she texts someone, she does a video call. These are all things that you know and interact with. I just have to establish that they exist in this world, at what level the technology exists. But in the epic fantasy, which is what I quoted for from today's for the most part, I have to establish the magic, and I have to establish what the technology level is, and I have to, like, there's a lot of description and culture because it's fully secondary world, right? So there's no connection back to Earth. So there I'm a lot more description heavy. And in the science fantasy, I was also very descriptive heavy because it does have secondary world approaches, and obviously, like, I have to establish the science and the fantastical elements and all of the rest of that. So I think some of it is genre dependent as well, the level of your description. Okay, so just to summarize, my techniques for bringing your world in is your characters' actions, their interaction with the environment that allows them to lore build. Let them touch historical statues. Let them experience the world around them and actually interact with it in a way that brings your world into the narrative. Um, show cultural practices in actions, things like greetings, things like how they establish kinship, things like the coffee ceremony. Use things like a coffee ceremony, a tea ceremony, whatever. Use those social interactions, those social rituals as a means to show the culture and frame a conversation, allowing it to be more than just dialogue. It's also actions that you can use. If we think back to that example that I used, things like Naira sprinkling cinnamon over the coffee beans. One, it brings us back to the fact that it's Naira's scene, and she is thus the POV character. And two, we actually we get to experience the cultural ritual of the coffee ritual. Then make sure that you show your magic. Don't blep your magic onto the page. And then in terms of dialogue, don't use as you know Bob dialogue, okay? But what you can do is you can use an anchor character, so somebody who doesn't know the dialogue, or you can have conflict-driven conversations, argumentation, or bait the bear conversations. Or you can have stating the obvious, where the character is stating the obvious with emotion attached to it. Or, as Rojet brought up, you can have reminiscing conversations where characters are very naturally reminiscing about the past, and that brings the dialogue into it. Dialogue is very powerful, but it has to feel natural, and there has to be enough tension in the conversation to keep the reader's attention. So you can't just reminisce like two old soldiers with no tension in the scene. The reason why the example that Rojet brought up, which is from Game of Thrones, which is when Robert and Edith are talking about Jaime. The reason why it's not boring is because there's tension in the scene, because they're discussing the politics that are going wrong for Robert, and that impacts Ned Stark. So it impacts Ned's life, and he is worried about it. He is worried about Jaime. So they're not just reminiscing about the past. There's also tension and conflict in the scene. So always make sure that there is conflict in the scene, even when you're using dialogue in a reminiscing fashion to talk about the past. So that's the ways to use dialogue and to avoid, as you know, Bob dialogue. And then finally, environmental storytelling and the words that you choose are very, very important. Things like using words that call back to the cultures that you're drawing from for your lore building can bring their baggage and their weight into the story and allow you to lore build with very, very few words just by leaning on readers' expectations. Okay. That's me. That's me. I don't know if there are any questions. I don't know if anybody feels that I missed anything. I hope that you guys found value in today's stream. Um, I hope that this was a long stream. Should maybe have broken this puppy up. I hope that you guys found value in the stream, and yeah, let me know if you have additional questions. All that. Oh! I have a newsletter, or I'm starting with a newsletter. It'll come out once every Nah. It'll come out four times a year, once every quarter. And in there, I will answer questions that you can submit to the newsletter, and then I will give like question and answer in the newsletter from people for people who subscribe to the newsletter. So if you're interested in the newsletter, on my website, mariemaloney.com, you can ask questions and subscribe to the newsletter and do all of those things. And there'll be, I'll go a little bit deeper on some topics than I do in the videos, and I'll do some. I'll have very short sections. I swear to God, I'll keep them short, where I'm talk about my own project, and then I'll do these questions and answers. So, yeah, I am so glad you all enjoyed it, and I will see you again for the next one. Bye, guys. pleasure as always. And welcome to the new studio as well. Bye.